Welcome to the first ever Mother Jones podcast live stream. I'm your host, Jamilah King in Brooklyn. It's just a week before the election. That's wild. I can't even wrap my head around that. And we've assembled a rock star cast of Mother Jones reporters, 8 reporters in total, spread out all across the country to come to our virtual newsroom and talk about everything you need to know to prepare for next week. We're calling it All Comes Down to This, and it really does. In this election special on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, we're going to get into early voting, the surge of disinformation, and Trump's last-ditch efforts to smear Biden, how to spend election night, because, how do you survive that? And so much more. Later on in the show, we're going to be chatting about the biggest Trump flashpoints from the last 4 years and what people are voting for and against. But first, to the topic at hand, the election. 1 week out. Are you sleeping? Because I'm definitely not. As we get down to it, things are so hard to predict, but to the extent that we can, we've got a really stellar lineup for you. How you should think about polling, getting to the polls, and if things are different from 2016. What's deja vu about this election and what's different? Joining me for the first half hour is DC Bureau Chief David Korn, politics reporters Tim Murphy and Kara Vogt, and voting rights reporter Ari Berman. Hey, guys.
Hey, Camille.
Hello.
Hey, good to see you.
So we'll get to polling and early voting in 2016 comparison soon, but first, David Korn, it's still possible that Trump could win. Tell us how.
It was possible in 2016. It's possible now. Now, in some ways, that's staggering. We have over 225,000 Americans who are dead, millions who will have contracted coronavirus and whose health will be affected for years and years to come. It's not just like you get over this and it's done. And of course, tens of millions of Americans who've been hit by the economic calamity attached to the pandemic. And yet it seems to be a close race. And even if Trump is within 5 points, that would still be a close race given this level of misery and incompetence that we've seen in the last year that was preceded by a lot of misery and incompetence in the 3 years before that. So I hate to say this, but, in some ways, Joe Biden is correct. Pause. It is a fight for the soul of the nation. There are people who look at Donald Trump and say, yeah, I want more of that. Yeah, I don't care that he is holding super spreading events that are literally killing his own supporters and those around them. And they say, that's fine with me, versus other Americans who are aghast at his 20,000 plus lies, handling the coronavirus, and his bigotry, racism, misogyny, you know the list. We talk about it every week. But still it boils down to the fact that America, in a lot of ways, is still not a 50-50 nation, a 45-45 nation, with a lot of people just voting for Republicans because they believe that they're part of that tribe. And the same thing for Democrats to an extent. So we saw this in 2016. It is a cliche in American politics that there's always a tightening at the end when people are driven by or pulled by their loyalties, past practices, to repeat what they're used to doing, Republicans voting for Republicans. Trump has made a bet that he could get every angry white guy Republican who's ever, who's breathing, not on a ventilator, to vote for him this year. And the question is how many of those people there are and if they're in the right places. So yes, he could win. The macro numbers are bad for him. Hillary got more votes last time. More Trump voters have passed away in the last 4 years. The demographics on the younger voters who are coming up are more Democratic than Republican. You look at what's happening in the Sun Belt, look what's happening in the Midwest, and some of the swing state polling. The macro numbers are all bad for Trump. He's not gaining votes in any category. Yet, still, he remains somewhat competitive. Plus, there'll be cheating, rigging, tantrums, all this stuff, and voter suppression efforts that Ari can talk to that are going to make this race probably closer than it has any right to be. So anyway, bottom line, get out, vote. Don't mail your ballot in at this point. You got to go or drop it off, and don't take anything for granted.
Now, David, you mentioned those macro numbers. Let's get into those a little bit. How much should we be listening to polls right now? Obviously, 4 years ago, Hillary was way ahead in the polls.
Well, she wasn't that far ahead. She wasn't. The polls weren't so wrong in 2016 in terms of the macro numbers. The national numbers. She won by a couple points, which was close within the margin of error, and the polls were close in the states that Trump won by less than 1%. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin that we're all familiar with. So they weren't that far off. But in a close race, if you have a margin of error of 3 to 4 points, that doesn't really tell you who's going to win at the end. So, polls, they help the campaigns figure out what they're doing. And sometimes it's more interesting to watch what they're doing and then try to say, okay, what do they think the polls are showing them? What do their internal numbers show? For everybody else, it's somewhat of a distraction. It gives you a sense of where things are. But again, in a race that's tight, in a country that is tight, in some states that decide these elections, a handful of states decide these elections by less than 1%. A poll is not going to really shouldn't give you much comfort, or you as a voter or a participant shouldn't really affect how you see things too much, or what actions you take. So the polls are there for us to talk about, but by and large, it's the issues which we'll discuss later. It's looking at the reality of what's happening in this country that that are perhaps more important, and that will have some impact on what happens on election day, election night, election week, maybe election month.
Oof. Oh, let's hope not. So let's turn it to Murphy. Tim, you're a political reporter. Did you have Borat on your 2020 bingo card as an October surprise?
I did, actually. Full disclosure. No, I think if there's one lesson of the last 16, 15 years is that you should never really count out Borat, when he's least expected. He's kind of like the Spanish Inquisition. But I did actually watch that this weekend, and I'll say the one thing that stood out, everybody talked about this scene with Rudy Giuliani doing whatever he's doing. The thing that really stood out to me, and I think actually speaks to something relevant about the election, is there's this kind of like, oh crap moment where they're at CPAC and Mike Pence is speaking and he's bragging, and it's February 27th, and he's telling this crowded room of people not wearing masks, all crowded together at CPAC, that there's only 15 cases of COVID-19 in the United States. It's February 27th. And that was just an incredibly jarring thing to say that really gets at where we are now.
Yeah.
I don't know if that'll, it's not really going to drive messaging, everybody going out to watch Borat, but it really does hit things home.
Right. So this time 4 years ago, Tim, was full of October surprises, the Access Hollywood tape, news about Russian election interference, reopening the email investigation by the FBI. Are we seeing any comparable drama this year? And, how much can you say is the same and how much is different?
It's a really weird kind of deja vu where we're just seeing the same thing, but stupider. Maybe that's what deja vu really is. But we're basically, the Trump campaign is trying to recreate the exact same playbook against a much different opposition. It's sort of, my mom always told me the story of submitting a poem in 5th grade and getting an A, then submitting the same one in 6th and 7th grade and getting a B and then a C. Trump against Hillary Clinton, had a person that people had been telling a story about for 30 years, and it was a very negative story in much of the national press, certainly in Republican politics. People haven't been telling that story about Joe Biden. And so they're introducing all these new characters to the drama at the last minute. They're trying to tell a story about Hunter Biden. I think a fairly sympathetic figure to a lot of people, especially people who know, loved ones suffering from addiction. It's just not really working. This isn't connecting with voters about, this kind of idea that they have about Joe Biden. He's just a much different figure in some ways really unfairly, and in some ways fairly than Hillary Clinton. But, there is this weird echo, right? Like, they're even talking about, lewd images on a laptop, which is like exactly, the kind of Anthony Weiner component of the Clinton emails scandal in October of 2016. So there's something very familiar, but it's playing out a lot differently so far.
Yeah,
talk about the generals always fighting the last war. They're like the Japanese soldiers stuck on the island, and they just think that the last fight is still going on. It's been pretty stunning, and also how inept Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon and this whole crew have been in trying to, at the last minute, generate these smears. And also, to Tim's point, repeat by getting another FBI investigation with Trump himself basically lambasting Christopher Wray, the FBI director, and Bill Barr, his handpicked AG, because they haven't, kicked off an investigation of Biden and Hunter Biden in the week before the election. How dare they not do this? So it's kind of, what is it? History repeats, and the second time is force. I mean, calling this a sea level poem, to take Tim's metaphor, would be giving it too much credit.
So, Kara, you were trying to jump in there. I just want to jump to you real quick. You cover progressive groups and the big alliances on the left, the movers and shakers. How are groups you're speaking to assessing the energy amongst voters right now?
I think in a couple of ways. And I think there's a big distinction between the progressive grassroots efforts that we've seen evolve in the Trump era. They're all over the country, versus some of the ones that are a little bit more DC based and are thinking about strategically what they might do in a Biden administration. The first things first, both those camps are like very aligned right now. Everyone, no matter what they actually think of Biden and his policies, and reminder that Biden had, kind of skated through the primary with a pretty basic message, a moderate message, not a lot of policy specifics, mostly just a promise, to David's point, to restore the soul of the nation, and that he could, do that pretty well. And a lot of people who had voted for folks like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were really disappointed to see him become the nominee. That said, everyone is holding hands and walking through the door together to get Joe Biden elected. I think people who sat out 2016 because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, they will not make that mistake again. This summer, I was talking to Sanders delegates to the DNC, ones who had caused a ruckus at the 2016 convention. And I asked them if they had planned to do anything, then to register their discontent as Biden accepted the nomination. I mean, they couldn't really because it was over Zoom. But even so, if they had been there in person, they said, no, I mean, I saw what happened when I did that last time. I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm going to vote. I'm going to organize. I'm going to get my friends to vote for Joe Biden. So it's pretty remarkable to see the kind of unity. I think a lot of people who are politically motivated by Trump's election, they're doing a lot more organizing than they were in 2016. We saw that in the midterms in 2018. The pattern is repeating itself. It's even more urgent. I think a lot of people, for better or worse, definitely for worse, who am I kidding, have been personally affected by the politics of the Trump era. I mean, whether it's people who have been separated across borders because of the types of immigration bans that Trump has imposed, women who feel like they have someone in the Oval Office who is just a complete detriment to their needs. And now we have COVID, and COVID is, pandemics don't really care what race you are. They don't care what gender you are. They don't care how rich you are. Some of those things can help you, certainly, in surviving it, and also, having your business survive and what have you. We've seen the virus take a horrible toll on communities of color. But all of that said, a lot of people have something personal at stake right now, and there's a lot of people who are motivated and definitely organizing on Biden's behalf.
So just a quick note to folks watching online. We know there are a few glitches people are seeing. Sorry about that. We are working to fix it. And we're going to just post this full conversation after this. So if you need to catch up and your feed is cutting out, thanks for hanging in there. It wouldn't be 2020 without just a little bit of teething. So Ari Berman, you are a voting rights specialist, the voting rights specialist. One thing that's different this year is that Trump has appointed 3 new justices to the Supreme Court in his first term. The Senate just confirmed Amy Coney Barrett last night, and she was sworn in this morning. How could this affect the election and voting rights moving forward?
Well, it could majorly affect the election. And I mean, the Supreme Court's affecting the election as we speak. I mean, minutes before Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed by the U.S. Senate, there was a very significant decision in Wisconsin that basically said that ballots postmarked by Election Day but received after don't have to count. So that means that tens of thousands of votes could be thrown out in Wisconsin. That was a 5-3 court. So you can imagine when it's a 6-3 court, how much further to the right it could lean. And so Amy Coney Barrett, for long term, is very, very worrisome for voting rights. I think the Supreme Court, with her on it, will try to roll back virtually all voting rights protections. But what it means in the short term is that if she doesn't recuse herself from these key election cases, and I believe and other legal scholars believe that she should absolutely recuse herself, given that she was nominated and confirmed 8 days before the election when 65 million people have already voted. But if she doesn't recuse herself from these cases, she is going to be able to hear a bunch of voting cases, possibly even before the election, that are important. There are cases, for example, in North Carolina and Pennsylvania about whether ballots postmarked by election day should be counted after. So she could weigh in on those cases. And then if there's litigation after the election, which Donald Trump has basically said, if he's down, he's going to challenge the results of the election in a lot of different ways, but try to challenge all sorts of different things with mail ballots, she could be in a position to rule on those cases. And now the Trump administration and the Trump campaign don't even have to worry about John Roberts anymore, who every once in a while rules against them because they think they have 5 solid conservatives. And the guy that was supposed to be the quote unquote swing justice now, Brett Kavanaugh, wrote one of the most insane and troubling voting rights decisions I've ever read in my life yesterday, where he basically said that if ballots arrive by mail after election day, that you're flipping the election results, and seemed like he was willing to shut down the counting of ballots, and cited Bush versus Gore and did all this other crazy stuff that felt like you were reading a Breitbart story as opposed to a brief from the new swing justice of the court.
Tim Murphy, it's been so long since the Democratic primaries, seems like ages ago. In hindsight, what was already working about Biden's candidacy that really has come together since then, and what just didn't really matter?
I mean, it's so bizarre to even think back on February. I think, following Biden around in the early states, these are states, places like Iowa, New Hampshire, even Nevada, they place a premium on candidates doing lots of in-person kind of events, over a long period of time, and, having lots of interactions with voters, lots of town halls. I mean, just tons of oversaturation of candidates. And Joe Biden didn't do very well in that format. I mean, he wasn't doing a million events, around the state like Pete Buttigieg or somebody like that. And that turned out to just be something that doesn't really matter during a massive pandemic. I mean, he hasn't done very many events since his convention, and before the convention, it was largely a digital campaign. And it just, so far, if you look at the polls and, trust the polls are largely right, I mean, that's just not, it's not going to make or break the election. So the extent to which this is not a retail campaign, I think, is played to Biden's strengths. And the strengths also showed up in the primary, basically as soon as I got home from Nevada. While he might not have been everybody's first choice, and while in that sort of or early sorting process of the primary, other people sort of would jump out in front of him or offer, different sort of ideas and plans that, captivated segments of the electorate. Nobody really hated Joe Biden. I mean, nobody was running from Joe Biden. He is just broadly acceptable to a large number of people. He's broadly popular. He doesn't alienate a ton of people. And you saw during the primary, there were a lot of, swing district Democrats who looked at Biden and said, this is the guy I can be on the ticket with. So he has just kind of kept chugging along, and he's brought, just a large number of sort of mainstream Democrats along with him, and a lot of, sort of independent voters, former Republicans who have started to vote Democratic, look at Joe Biden and he's a Democrat they can get behind. So just the sort of steadiness of Joe Biden throughout over, however many years it is, with not, he's got a really strong personal story. He talks, fairly often, about his own family's personal tragedy in ways that kind of connect with people in a non-partisan way. So that's all worked out very well for him as just, when you talk about how the campaign has ended up sort of on his terms about, as he says, healing the soul of the nation. He's sort of got the message and the personality for that.
And just,
what's interesting? Oh, go ahead, Kara.
Oh, I was going to say, just to riff on Tim's point too, I think one thing that's consistent across the primary and the general, even though so much has changed since the primary, to Tim's point, no one wanted to take a risk in 2020. Like, as much as a lot of people were voting, Pete Buttigieg technically won the Iowa caucuses and Bernie won in New Hampshire and Nevada. A lot of people, when it came down to it, didn't really want anything but the vanilla ice cream of politicians. They really wanted something that was reliable and consistent. And as much as the ideas, and there are some amazing ideas that have come out of the primary, we're now seeing some of them manifest themselves in Joe Biden's campaign platform. There just was no interest in taking a risk when Donald Trump was also going to be on the ballot. And I think a lot of people understood that and reacted to that even before there was a pandemic.
And I would add to that point by saying during the primary, particularly those 7 years that seemed to go on before we even got to voting, there was an argument within the Democratic Party with people like Bernie and others saying the way to win is you get a lot of, you go to the left, you electrify younger voters and voters who haven't voted before, and, and you overcome the establishment, and you get all this energy, and that's how you beat Trump. And it turned out that theory was proven, even before the pandemic hit, really, not to be quite operative. In that, yes, the people who supported Bernie, and you can say the people who supported Elizabeth Warren and others, who were to the left of Joe Biden, were far more enthusiastic than the people who supported Biden. If you went to those rallies, and we were, in events in New Hampshire and elsewhere, Pete Buttigieg, there was more electricity in the room. There was more in the room, more people in the room than you saw with Joe Biden. But yet, when it came to the macro terms, when you got to bigger electorates, when you got to South Carolina and some of those other states, as COVID was coming into play as well, there weren't as many people who wanted to be electrified and who wanted a ideologically stronger candidate within the Democratic primaries. So, I think Bernie ran a great campaign. He's run 2 great campaigns, but he hasn't demonstrated yet that going to the left and calling yourself a socialist gets you more voters. It gets you more excited voters, that's for sure, but not more voters. And in some ways, Democrats always wanted this to be a referendum on Trump. They got it. And if you're running against somebody, sort of running a campaign in which the other person's the issue, you want to present a candidate in some ways, at least conventionally, according to conventional thinking, that causes the least amount of fuss, that has less people upset or angry, or that alienates people the least amount. And, to Tim's point, Biden, he could stay, in his apartment or his house, it's not an apartment, and people already knew him. He didn't have to get out there and show people who he was. We've been living with Joe Biden, as Donald Trump Jr. reminds us, for 47 years. You have an opinion of him, going out there and doing something different. Part of the problem with Hillary Clinton in 2016 is that she felt she had to identify herself, rebrand herself in some ways. But we've been living with Hillary Clinton for 30 years as well. Right. And so people had strong impressions one way or the other. And she didn't build into that as much as say, I had to reinvent myself. You can't reinvent Joe Biden. Joe Biden can't reinvent Joe Biden. So, people didn't have to go out to rallies to have an opinion about Joe Biden. They don't have to see him now. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, because usually if you look at candidates, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, a lot of them break onto the national scene, and they're not well known nationally. Barack Obama wasn't well known nationally.
Right, but Joe Biden definitely is.
We know too much.
We've known him. Got it.
Okay,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Ari.
Vote for me. I'll talk to you in 4 years. Just let me go to work.
I was just going to say that one of the amazing things that we're seeing so far is just how broad the Democratic coalition is when it comes to the early voting numbers. That I don't think we've seen so many different coalitions in a party before. I mean, Trump's base is basically a shrinking conservative white minority that they are trying to juice up, but they're not really bringing anyone new into the process. But you look at the increase in young voters, which is staggering all across the country. You look at the fact that in Texas, turnout's being driven by a lot of different factors. It's Black voters, it's Latino voters, but it's also formerly Republican voters from the suburbs that are turning out in record numbers. And all of these counties are changing. You look at, there's Black voters in Georgia and places like that that are turning out in huge numbers. And so Joe Biden, despite being a really vanilla guy, has built this incredible coalition behind him. That's about a lot of things that are bigger than Joe Biden. It's about Trump, and it's about the pandemic, and it's about people feeling that their rights in all sorts of different ways are under attack. But if you just look at how broad and diverse the coalition is now that represents the Democratic Party, it's pretty amazing. And it's pretty amazing how quickly politics is changing, that Arizona and Texas, that these places are now competitive. And instead of, I thought, we would be talking about 3 states the entire election. And it's refreshing that at least we're talking about maybe 10 states instead of 3, which is, I guess, the best we can do in this day and age with the Electoral College.
So, all right, to your point, we're seeing record-setting numbers of early voters across the country. A week before Election Day, more than 64 million Americans have already voted. Can we surmise anything from early voting numbers about who is voting?
I think we can surmise that Democrats are very excited about voting, that they've utilized different means of voting. There was obviously a lot of emphasis on vote by mail. And in fact, lots of Democrats have voted by mail, but a lot of Democrats have also voted early in person. And they've been shattering early in person turnout in places like Harris County and Houston as well. And so turnout is basically up among almost all groups. It's certainly, it's up among young voters. It's up among Black voters in places like Georgia. I looked at Texas. It was up among Latino voters in Harris County. It was up among Asian American voters in Harris County. It was up among young voters in Harris County. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and just in talking to people in Georgia and talking to people about Texas, I mean, Trump has been very open about the kind of voter suppression that he wants to see, and the fact that he wants to demobilize Democrats. And I think a lot of Democrats heard that, and it made them extra motivated to turn out, that there was a feeling that if our votes didn't matter, why would Republicans be trying so hard to suppress them? And I think Democrats, there are still going to be people that fall through the cracks. There are still going to be people who don't have their votes counted, who aren't able to wait in 11-hour lines, or have their mail ballots thrown out, or are purged from the voting rolls. But there are also people that are really committed to make sure that this election doesn't end up like 2016, that history doesn't repeat itself, and that they think the best way to do that is to vote in record numbers and to vote early. And the most important thing that elected officials were saying in the Democratic Party was make sure you vote early. And so far, Democrats have got that message.
Let's project ourselves into next Tuesday if we can. David, just quickly, with a few minutes left, there's been talk about an initial red wave where the votes of folks turning up in person on the day of the election may skew Republican, but Democratic absentee ballots and mail-in votes might take a little bit longer. How worried should we be about that? And most importantly, how do you advise us to spend election night? Tell me, David, tell me your secrets.
With a good drink in hand, maybe a couple. I'm going with, I think, rum. But there is something that's been demonstrated over the past couple election cycles called the blue shift, which is, as you count votes late into the night, into the next day, particularly absentee ballots or other provisional ballots that are still being litigated afterwards, things shift in the Democratic direction. This is likely to be more pronounced this year with, per what Ari just said about the great, increase in mail-in voting and maybe drop-off voting. And so there are some states, people talking a lot about Florida, where they will be counting mail-in votes on the day of. Some states will be doing this for days afterwards. Some states are still fighting. Some of these cases may reach even the Supreme Court to determine how far you can keep counting. So, Tuesday night can go in a lot of different ways. It could be a decisive win for Biden if he surprises people and wins Florida. That could more or less be it. That would be a very surprising development, but it's within the realm of consideration. Trump, looking at 2016 and everything else, again, you have to sort of say there's still a chance, as we talked about earlier. But the most likely scenario is that we're going to have to take a deep breath and wait, hopefully a couple of days, hopefully not longer, to get some final results in the swing states that matter the most, whether it's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and others. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Texas may take a while, who knows. But the important thing to know is that throughout that time, if Trump is ahead on the votes as being reported in the day of voting in Florida and Texas, wherever it might be, he's going to declare victory. He's already told us that. There should be no votes counted after election night, which should be going against every rule and law that have guided our elections for years. So people are going to have to not get freaked out about that. They're going to have to not let his tantrum and his antics shape the race. And I think a lot of the mainstream media, conventional media, have sort of absorbed this lesson, and it will be Trump against the world if he tries to do something like that. So it may take a while to sort this out. There are some doomsday scenarios that take weeks or months to sort out. We don't have time to go into that now. I think those are looking less likely than they might have been, but still, we're in for a wild ride. So whatever you need to get you through the night, get it ready before the night.
So much to talk about, but we have to get to our second panel. DC Bureau Chief David Korn, politics reporters Tim Murphy and Kara Vogt, and voting rights reporter Ari Berman. Thank you guys so much. We so appreciate having you on this first ever live stream.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
We're going to take a quick break. Coming up, we'll be joined by our in-house experts to untangle the wild world of disinformation and Trump's continual appeals to racism with 4 more reporters, Ali Breland, Pema Levy, Fernanda Chavity, and Natalie Baptiste. And, if you have a question for us, drop it in the comments wherever you're watching this. We would love to get to it. Stay tuned.
Hi, it's James West here from Mother Jones magazine. I'm a deputy editor here, and thank you so much to Jamilah King and the whole newsroom for pulling this live broadcast of the Mother Jones podcast together. It's looking awesome, and thank you for watching. I want to give you a sneak peek of something that we've been working hard on. 2020 has been an insane year. In fact, I've been reporting from this couch in my home for the whole year since March. We've been running at this coronavirus story from every single angle for months. This came in the mail just yesterday. It's called The Plague, How Trump Bungled America's Coronavirus Response, and it's our first ever special issue of Mother Jones. And it's jam-packed with all of our reporting from across the year. A detailed timeline, beautiful photography, reporting from across the Mother Jones newsroom, and analysis that you don't want to miss about the global pandemic. It's called The Plague. You can get your hands on this right now by going to motherjones.com/plague. You can get it before it's out on newsstands by going to that URL, motherjones.com/plague. And while you're on the website, check out all of our other reporting there about the coronavirus, including a detailed timeline of Trump's coronavirus denial, and this video, the first 100 days of Trump's actions after the global pandemic came to America. Jamilah King and the whole crew will be back just after this.
One person coming in from China.
We think it's going to have a very good ending. A lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat.
When it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
It's not been spreading very much.
Very good shape.
I think it's going to work out fine.
Very well under control.
The risk to the American people remains very low. View this the same as the flu.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
Almost everybody that we see is getting better. Now the Democrats are politicizing, and this is their new hoax. #1 in the world for preparedness.
The Obama administration made a decision on testing that turned out to be very detrimental.
I like the numbers being where they are.
Anybody that wants a test can get a test. Be calm. It's really working out.
I think we're going to get through it very well.
Okay. Well, let's put it this way. I'm not concerned.
No, I don't take responsibility at all.
That is the biggest one-day point drop of all time.
They shouldn't be criticizing because we've done a fantastic job. Federal government's not a shipping clerk. Chloroquine, and some people would add to it hydroxy. It's not going to kill anybody. We're really backing up the governors. The governors have to go out, do their thing. All you have to do is look at the approval numbers. We can't have the cure be worse than the problem. Easter Sunday, and you'll have packed churches all over our country. I think it would be a beautiful time. More tests than anybody by far. It's hard not to be happy with the job we're doing.
We've now established great testing. We inherited a broken system.
I want them to be appreciative. Don't call the woman in Michigan. If they don't treat you right, I don't call.
We should be a backup.
We're not an ordering clerk, we're a backup. And I hope they use the hydroxychloroquine. What do you have to lose? What do you have to lose? What do I know? I'm not a doctor. We're the federal government. We're not supposed to stand on street corners doing testing. The authority is total.
I'm sure people will be very happy to get a big, fat, beautiful check, and my name is on it.
22 million out of work.
And then I see the disinfectant injection inside. Sounds interesting to me.
Welcome back. I'm Jamilah King, and you're watching a special live recording of the Mother Jones podcast. Now, we have reporters Natalie Baptiste, Fernanda Chavarri, Pema Levy, and Ali Breland here to get into some of the big policy issues and what's at stake if Trump pulls off this election. We just heard from our previous panel about some of the bigger picture ideas behind what's going to happen next week. But right now, we want to get into the brass tacks of just sort of the ugliness of the Trump era. So, Fernanda, let's start with you. There is no doubt that one of the greatest horrors of the Trump presidency has been his immigration policies and his treatment of Latinx folks. Can you tell us a little bit about what the most egregious immigration policies are that Trump has either instituted or enforced?
Well, there's a lot. I think there's plenty to choose from, and there has been damage across many different groups of immigrants in this country and outside of this country. So I would say one of the most significant ones are the family separation policy, which the administration calls the zero tolerance policy. It has done irreparable damage to thousands of families. Parents were separated from their kids at the border to, in a sense, deter more parents from coming to the United States with their children, to show, if you come to the United States, we'll take your kids away, essentially. And they did that. And as recently as last week, we saw some reports of more than 500 families who were never reunited, whose parents cannot even be found. So the United States, the Trump administration took children from their parents' arms and essentially turned some of them into orphans to make a point that migrant families shouldn't come to the United States to seek asylum. And asylum in general has been completely dismantled. This administration, and over the last 4 years, Trump has essentially destroyed what asylum means in this country. The process from big policies to small changes that we continue to see throughout the years, and one of the biggest ones was the Remain in Mexico policy. That makes it so that families and people who are not from Mexico and ask for asylum at the port of entry in the southern border essentially get told to just go ahead and wait in Mexico for months or however long it takes, while their asylum cases are pending in the United States. And that has kept more than 68,000 people, a lot of them families, many of them with little kids, living in Mexican border towns. So he has essentially destroyed what it means to seek asylum in this country.
Fernanda, how could a Biden win alleviate the damage that Trump has done on the border?
It would take a lot of work and a long time to undo some of these policies. However, a lot of these weren't acts of Congress. These are not laws that were changed, many of them. So Biden would have the power to, on day one, say the executive order that is keeping migrants, or the policy that's keeping migrants on Mexican border towns, Remain in Mexico, is done with. But that doesn't mean that these thousands of families will just come in or would have an opportunity for a fair asylum hearing. So there's so much that Biden would need to do, and it would take a lot of work. And on the non-policy side, people's lives have been destroyed. So Biden or no Biden, changes or no changes, for the last 4 years, there's been so much damage to the mental health and physical health of people all over the world with these immigration policies that it's going to take a lot of work.
Natalie Baptiste, racial justice has become a top-line issue during this election season after the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and George Floyd set off waves of Black Lives Matter protests. Tell us the ways in which Trump has leaned even further into his racial attacks over the past couple of weeks.
Over the past couple of weeks, sensing a coming loss, I really think that Trump is just deciding to, let it all out. unfortunately for him, Joe Biden is white. So he's like, all right, if I want to do my racist attacks, I got to find someone else. So, you have them at rallies fear mongering about Cory Booker coming into your suburbs. And we all hear that dog whistle. He's fear mongering about Vice President Kamala Harris. Ooh, she's a spooky socialist. And of course, his favorite target, Barack Obama. I mean, what year is this?
Natalie, whoever thought the 2016 election represented the lowest points of his racism, we now have Trump's 4 years to actually judge him by. What's your top line takeaway?
I think my top line takeaway from the last 4 years is that no matter what it is that Trump is doing and saying, there's like a 99% chance that it's actually just racism. I mean, everything from his coronavirus response to, how he responded to the massive protests that were actually multiracial. There's just always that natural instinct to think, how can I blame people of color? And honestly, people who support people of color, in quote unquote, all these blue cities with all this crime going up. I mean, we all know what he means by that for sure.
Yeah. Ali, I saw you nodding a bit to Natalie's answer. You have anything to add on that front?
No, I mean, I think that Natalie hits it on the head, and I think that it also tracks to sort of into the patterns of disinformation that Trump is drawing on. Like Natalie said, there seems to be like a very clear racial pattern that would suggest like just clear racism within these patterns of disinformation, and it manifests itself in these sorts of bizarre, nonsensical ways, saying things that like Kamala Harris is to the left of Bernie Sanders.
Right.
You can say a lot of things about Kamala. That's not one of them.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, Ali. It seems to me like Trump and his team are trying everything they can to throw as much disinformation and nastiness at the wall to repeat their upset victory from 2016. How does disinformation, how does the Trump disinformation machine actually work?
It's hard to pin down, not because it's done secretly, but because it's done so prolifically and so vastly all the time. It's so seemingly chaotic that it seems like there's almost like no rhyme or reason. And some of it is just Trump at his rallies, at his last rally, spewing just different types of lies and things that he seemingly makes up on the fly, misrepresenting facts from things like saying that ICE has arrested thousands of murderers, which isn't true. All the way to things absurd is just the U.S. like being in a period of like having the largest soybean orders of all time, just absolutely quotidian things that don't even play into a clear strategy. It's just like his MO at this point. There is some strategy to it, definitely, though. The Harris example is one of them. In his Facebook ads too, you can see that he's tried to sort of make inroads again and like sort of lie about Joe Biden's links and Hunter Biden's dealings in Ukraine. Facebook has kind of cracked down on his ability to do that, so he's more thinly veiled, saying sort of more ambiguous things like Joe Biden sold America out to make his family rich. There's no Ukraine mention in there, but I think that the subtext is pretty obvious.
Right. Pema Levy, Facebook has been a hotbed for QAnon conspiracy theories, weaponizing white supremacy. Facebook took a lot of heat, not because they're not monitoring or like amplifying these messages. What lessons has Facebook learned from this election, and what kinds of changes have they and Twitter already made?
Yeah, I think we really love this narrative that people are going to learn and grow from their mistakes, right? So you look at 2016, right? Facebook became the vector through which Russia spread a lot of disinformation. And so then Facebook said, oh, sorry, we messed up. We have a lot to learn. We're going to really do better next time. Well, we're in the next time and things are much worse. I mean, there's far more disinformation now on Facebook than there was before. And it's not just coming from Russia, it's coming from, domestic sources, coming from right-wing sources. They've purposely tweaked their algorithms to boost news sites. I'm using scare quotes here for the news sites, places that have been labeled by independent moderators as manipulators and sources of, fake news, essentially. And Facebook's algorithms literally, boost those so that people see them more, and they tamp down on real news on places like Mother Jones. You see Facebook literally using their algorithms to encourage people to join groups that think the pandemic is a hoax, think that vaccines will cause autism, think that QAnon is real. So after 2016, you saw things get absolutely worse. And so I have no faith that they will learn a lesson. I don't think that that's what they're capable of. I think they respond to their bottom line and to power and to market share. And so, yes, in the last few weeks, actually, and I guess month, they've made some changes. They're finally cracking down on QAnon groups. They say they're gonna take down some anti-vaxxer ads. They say they're gonna eliminate political ads after the election. But I think, a lot of people are sort of thinking that Facebook is really just reading the tea leaves here. They're afraid that Biden is going to become president, and then that Democrats will turn to Silicon Valley and Facebook in particular and try to regulate them and crack down on what's been going on. And so this is sort of a self-preservation measure. And I think watching Facebook over the years, that's just what we should assume from them. They will act out of self-preservation. And I haven't seen really any evidence that they're going to act out of any sort of moral desire to protect our democracy.
Do you think that's going to be enough? Oh, sorry. I think Ali, you were trying to get in there. Go ahead.
I just want to briefly jump in and say too, to Pema's point, that even if Facebook were to magically decide tomorrow that they really wanted to change tack, their sort of history of approaching these things is very laissez-faire and uninvolved as possible. Like Pema said, is just created a slew of problems that perfect moderation tomorrow wouldn't even fix, because they've created all of these sorts of extremist subgroups that will find homes elsewhere. And even if starting now is good in the long term, we have a short-term mess that we have to deal with from this already.
Yeah, they've totally opened Pandora's box. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, yeah, they've really opened Pandora's box here, and it's going to be incredibly hard to put a lid on it. They certainly can't do it on their own at this point, and they certainly haven't built up the capacity to do it, because they've really, until now, and I see no reason that this would change. They've sort of decided that they will, tamp down on problems by putting out press releases and, hoping that makes everyone look another way.
Ali or Pema, what could Facebook do better to stop racist harassment on their platform? Let's start with you, Ali.
This is a hard question, because the sort of MO that Facebook has taken that a lot of people demand is more scrupulous moderation. But the problem is that ends up putting a lot of pressure on these sort of underpaid, overworked moderators who don't even actually work for Facebook. They're subcontracted out. They deal with just very poor conditions comparatively. Right now, there's a lot of controversy because they're being forced to go back into the office while the rest of Facebook's actual staff doesn't have to. And Facebook has practical reasons for wanting to do this, but it's a very unfair way to treat these people who are functionally the backbone of one of the most important issues that your company is facing. I think that it requires some sort of structural change that would just be damaging to Facebook's business model that they're probably unwilling to do, but it would require some sort of general upfront movement to make the flow of information on Facebook to introduce more friction, so that people can't sort of have these artificially large followings and spread information out. And some people might not want that. I don't even think that's a discussion that's very developed in these types of discourse, but I think it would require Facebook losing a lot of money in a way that they don't want to.
Right. Well, so Pema, even though social media platforms have been spreading disinformation and hate, they've also been crucial for campaigns during the socially distant election season. How do you run a presidential campaign virtually? What are the strengths and weaknesses there?
Yeah, right. Virtual is, digital is really all you've got these days, right? Obviously, Donald Trump has started holding rallies again. There's evidence that he's spreading coronavirus as he does it. So I think it's really safest to keep things online right now. And, I think that's really hard. I think that the face-to-face is really important. But I have seen some really creative ways to get around that. And a lot of folks who are saying, the old ways of campaigning, of door knocks, of phone banking was pretty stale. And that there's a lot of ways that we can communicate that are actually much more effective. And maybe this will actually get us to, get campaigns and independent groups to actually be better at engaging voters. One of them that I've written about is relational organizing, which basically says, instead of just knocking on a stranger's door, call your friend, right? Text your parent. and talk to them, because people are just much more receptive to hearing from someone they know than a stranger. And there have been studies done on this. It sounds really kind of simple and basic, right? But they do studies, and it's just incredibly more effective when you're talking to your own networks, as opposed to, dialing up a stranger who's like, yeah, sure, okay, sure, I'll say whatever you want me to, so you can, let me get back to my shows. So I think that there's a lot of innovative work. There's a lot of innovative digital work around that too, a lot of tech. And so, I think it's quite possible that we'll see campaigning and sort of digital campaigning really change in positive ways as a result of the pandemic. We're always searching for small silver linings, so that might be one of them.
So I want to just change tacks for a bit. One of the biggest crises to hit the Trump presidency has been the spread of the contagious and deadly coronavirus. Trump's response to the pandemic has been lacking, to say the least, from the denials to the lies to the bungled response. More than 220,000 Americans have now died, according to the latest count. Natalie, how has the coronavirus magnified pre-existing inequities in American society?
When coronavirus first hit the country, there was a lot of talk about how this would be the great equalizer. And I think now we find out that that's not true, and that was never going to be the case. You see, with coronavirus, it is a type of disease that you are more susceptible to if you are living in poverty, if you work a job where you have to come into contact with lots and lots of people. And I think, as we all know, more Black and brown people are living in poverty. More Black and brown people have service jobs. They drive buses, they deliver the mail, and these are essential jobs. So, the Trump response almost kind of just like twisted the knife just a little bit deeper, because, him just acting like it's just not a big deal despite getting the virus himself, like, really shows that, look, he knows that people who aren't even going to vote for him are the ones being disproportionately impacted by it. So, who cares? Let them die.
Fernanda, what are you seeing about the ways the pandemic has impacted Latinx communities specifically?
I think similar to what Natalie was saying, and for a lot of Latinos, this is sort of a perfect storm of a combination of limited access to healthcare, a lot of times having to do with your immigration status or the status of someone in your household for mixed status families, living in multi-generational homes, working essential jobs, using public transportation, and then having a lack of a trusted messenger has really put Latinx communities all over the country at risk. And we are seeing them get they have a disproportionate rate of infection in most states, and in some of them they're dying at higher rates than their share of the population. And I think that also on top of the healthcare and the access to healthcare, Latinos have been hit incredibly hard economically, especially folks who are working jobs that are paid under the table, washing dishes in the back of a restaurant, or the paletero in the corner, or the lady that sells your gorditas or the taco stand. And there has been no relief for them. They weren't, undocumented folks were not included in any sort of relief package, and families who share a household with a person who's undocumented also were not, didn't qualify for any kind of government relief. So unemployment insurance and government relief, that has helped a lot of people, but it has left a lot of people out, including immigrants who have been in this country for decades and who have paid taxes, income taxes, with a special tax ID number. And I heard from these people directly. I've been on the phone with these women, the house cleaner and the food vendor, who have been just so hurt by this pandemic, both the health aspect of it and economically.
And I wanted to add that what's really devastating about this situation is just even this idea that there can be, two recoveries, one for those who can stay home and one for those who can't, or lack thereof. And it's sad, because I think that the virus is spreading because people still have to go to work. They can't stay home. We're not allowing them to stay home. So this idea that this pandemic will end and we just have to ride it out is probably not going to come true, not until we start taking care of everyone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that, Natalie. Ali, it certainly hasn't helped that there's such an amplification of vaccine denial and science denial by folks like QAnon and other fringe groups. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, where are folks getting their information, and what harm is that information doing?
Yeah, people are getting a lot of information in different Facebook groups, YouTube videos. If you're not in these spaces, it's surprising the volume and the sort of reach that these things have. But for a lot of people, for younger people, and even for people outside of that demographic, YouTube has become a primary source of news. There's celebrities within this world that like mean nothing to people who watch MSNBC or CNN, but are arguably more popular and have larger followings than the anchors on those networks. And the problem is like sometimes that information is good. A lot of times it's not vetted and ends up being just a source of massive amounts of misinformation. Facebook has thankfully finally taken the step of eradicating QAnon groups on its platforms. I've been in a lot of these groups. I've sort of built up a following in them, or I've built up my own like groups that I've followed over the course of years, and they've been eradicated. Other researchers did more comprehensive studies and found that they're gone, which is great. But there's other groups that still exist regarding anti-vaccinations and things like that. And it's a little bit harder to track the situation on Instagram. And also to my point earlier, like I said, like the damage has already been done. Even if these groups are gone and people's sort of beliefs aren't proliferating and growing in the moment and in the day sort of leading up to the election, they've had months and years to fester and to blow out and to sort of create these like information echo chambers. And even if they're not talking right now, they didn't just change their minds.
Final question, Pema. A big focus during the Democratic primaries was healthcare, with the more progressive candidates pushing for a single-payer system. Then we were hit with a pandemic. Trump famously says that he has a plan, but of course he doesn't. Is it still the biggest issue for Democratic voters beyond COVID itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the economy is obviously up there, but healthcare is always, a top concern for voters. And then you add a pandemic on top of it. And then you add a new Supreme Court justice on top of it when the Supreme Court is about to hear a case on November 10th to once again see if the Supreme Court will get rid of Obamacare. We're still doing this. We're still litigating Obamacare here. And people know that, right? And I think that the Biden campaign and Democrats have really sort of hammered that throughout. And then you see in the debates, Joe Biden says, I have a plan. I'm going to create a public option so that if you don't have healthcare, you can get it. And then you have Trump saying, I want to get rid of Obamacare. And then, maybe one day I'll have a plan. And so I think really we're entering an election that is absolutely about healthcare. And the choices are incredibly obvious. I mean, Trump will go into interviews and literally say, I don't have a plan. I'm working on it, maybe. And they've been saying that for 4 years, actually, maybe since 2009 when Obamacare was put forward, right? They've always just said, well, we'll have a plan, and then they never had one. And I think voters get that now. I think they get what the choice is. And I guess, we'll see what happens in a week, but that choice is very clear.
Natalie, Fernanda, any final quick thoughts?
Oof. I think on the immigration front, I think a second term of the Trump administration, and when it comes to immigration, I should say the Trump-Miller administration, Stephen Miller has been really the mastermind behind a lot of these really cruel policies. I spoke with a couple immigration experts actually this week for a piece that I'm writing, and things could look a lot worse, especially with the Supreme Court on his side. We just learned that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear some cases on some of the policies that Trump has implemented to keep asylum seekers out of the country. So I think that, final thought is immigration looked bad for the last 4 years, and it's hurt a lot of people, and it could be worse if there's a second term from Trump.
Natalie, last word.
The last word is that, we're 1 week away from the election, and Trump and his Republican cronies are doing everything they can to stop people from voting. And a lot of that looks pretty racist. They want to have poll watchers. They want to stop people from being able to mail in their ballots. And I think that when historians look back, they'll be able to see what the overarching theme of the Trump presidency was, and that's racism.
It's time to wrap up this conversation, but what an amazing hour. I always love when I get to talk to my colleagues about their work. Thank you guys so much for coming on. Earlier, you heard from Tim Murphy, David Korn, Ari Berman, and Kara Vogt. We just heard from Natalie Baptiste, Ali Breland, Fernanda Chavity, and Pema Levy. Thanks, everyone. Okay, that's it for this special live recording of the Mother Jones podcast. I'm your host, Jamilah King. I know that a lot of folks had some issues watching live, but not to worry. If you want to watch it again, we will be reposting this video on Facebook and YouTube. And we will be airing a special version of this conversation on the podcast, which comes out tomorrow. As always, if you like what you heard during this segment, just please donate. Go to motherjones.com. Give. Any little gift helps. And if you want to check out the podcast and you haven't before, that's easy to do too. Just go to wherever you listen to those things and hit subscribe. Like I said, I'm Jamilah King, and I'll see you next time.